Hi, I'm James McKernan. Welcome back to my shop, The Scenery Farm. What we have here is my new paint rack. It's mostly built out of scrap material, and what it allows me to do is finish all my drawer fronts or door fronts, smaller dress gables, over wherever I'm going to do my finishing work, and then I'll dry them on this rack. That means that not every surface area in my shop is covered in wet cabinetry. So, when I've used paint racks before, one of the weaknesses that I've seen is a straight shelf right across here. When you're finishing wood and the top and the sides have been done, the paint on an 1/8 inch roundover will kind of touch the bottom edge a little bit. And if you put this on a flat shelf, then you're going to be having to sand that back a bit before you finish the other side of it. If you do what I've done here, you should be able to finish most sizes of drawer fronts or cabinet doors and not have that happen. I'm just going to orient you the whole thing. It's got a plywood base, on the bottom of which I have 4 casters. And then the sides, you can see the sides are taller than the front. The reason the sides are tall is because I wanted to have triangulation. So this bottom piece here is affixed from the underside and actually from the top to the actual bottom of the unit where the casters are mounted, and that means that these uprights here are attached multiple points so that it's not going to have a tendency to tip. If you're going to have something like this, it makes sense to load it evenly on both sides if you're going to do a full load, so like half on one and half on the other. But so that's why they're a little taller. And in the bottom, what I have are sandbags. And the whole reason I have this, 2 reasons. One, to keep the sides from tipping over. And the other reason is just to make sure that the sandbags don't come out. I have sandbags in the unit because I want it to be bottom heavy. When I'm moving this around, I don't want there to be any tendency for it to want to fall over, especially when I have a lot of weight on it. This unit here, it's basically made up of two uprights, it's got 2 uprights, and what I did was I pre-marked the uprights. Every 5 inches I put a line on them before I assembled them, and I knew where this was going to go. I drew a line on that as well. I have this plate in the center and a plate at the top and a mirroring plate at the bottom, and a top piece and a bottom piece. Looks exact same at the bottom. And the reason for these is to keep this from wanting to go over like a house of cards. On the bottom of this unit here has a plate that goes from here to here, just sitting behind this front and on the inside of the sides. It's fixed with pins and screws and glue, and I screwed that down to lock it in place, but then I continued and I came through the underside of the dolly into the end grain of this ply here. I pre-drilled everything and countersunk it, and that way the plywood it holds a lot of its strength still. Now, you can see that I have this piece is slightly different than these. The only reason for that is I did want to use this height for a shelf, but I didn't need the full design of this unit here because there was nothing going underneath this one, and there were no other shelves going underneath this one, so I didn't have to do this back cut. And I didn't need it to go the full length, so I actually used part of my router templates and just cut them up and mounted those there. This is undercut here so that I have a wider opening from here to here, so it's easier for me to put pieces in and take them out. I had started with a 45-degree angle on here was the first thing I did, and then I did a table saw cut here, and I also routed all of these in here, and I'm going to show you close up what those are for. So the reason I put these under, again, is just so that when you put a finished piece on the drying rack, the lip around the corner, which will still be damp from the finishing, is gonna touch here unless I cut these kind of divots out of this unit. So my hope was that I had this wider, it's about 4 inches wide, so drawer faces up to about this size can sit on here, and then once they get to about this size, I can go over 2 of them to hold that, and if they're bigger, then I can go over these ones here, right? Or I can go here to here, but I'm sure I'll find a size that's harder to get, but the reason I did these was just so that the edges would not be compromised when they're drying until they're cured while they're sitting on the drying rack. What I'm going to show you here is how I came up with this shape, and I made it consistent. This is these are the shelves for the drying rack, and they're not done yet. I have to do some further cuts on here, but essentially what I did was I created a template, and this is, if you imagine this without these notches, this is just a blank piece of wood. And what I did was, and the blank piece of wood looked like this. I took small blocks of wood and I put little wee chamfers. You can see them right there. And I stepped them a 1/4 inch down all the way along. And then I flush trim routered out these bits here. And these are the bits where the ends of the pieces that I'm drying will sit. And then when I'm done this, I'm going to round it all over so it's got no sharp edges. And so once I did one side, I laid it down on the bench. I'd remove these here. I literally took my cat's paw. I'd put this in with an 18 gauge brad, 1.25 inches. What's really important is that your brad isn't too long so that you poke through the other side, because you don't want to poke through the other side. But a couple 18 gauge brads, 18-inch brads, that would be an interesting thing. 18 gauge brads will hold this in place enough for you to do 1 or 2 routers on it. So, and because this isn't getting finished, this is not a finished piece of wood, these little holes on the side won't bother anyone. I pop the brads out with my end cutters, and I have the template piece. Once I have the template piece, I'm then going to bring it over to the router jig that I've set up right over here. So what I've done here is, this is all just, the perimeter stuff is all just scrap wood. My assembly table is covered in hardboard. It's 2 thicknesses of 3/4 inch plywood. It's covered in hardboard, and the hardboard has a just under 1/8 inch gap in between the sheets. As humidity changes, these will buckle if you don't do that. I've countersunk and screwed in, and every once in a while when I'm clear coating something, I'll just give this a sand back and I'll put a new clear coat on it so it's nice and smooth, slide things on. And also sand it back, because when you put screws in it, every once in a while, or when you put a screw in hardboard, it puckers up a bit. So you have to be able to get rid of that over time. And then I find that I can get this hardboard to last me years until I finally put too many holes in it and I'm in the mood and I change it. But what I've done here is this scrap wood I've all just screwed down here, and I'll take one of the template pieces and I'll put it right in. So this is the original, and then I take a blank, and I put it in here, and I've got these pieces here to stop it, and I've got these pieces here on the points to stop it, so it sits right in place, and it gets it pretty close, and the sawdust then won't build up on these points. What it'll mean is the sawdust just pushes out of the way. And there's no sawdust in here, but if there were, I'd just blow on it to get that out of there. Drop this in here. And I'm lucky actually with the base of my router, the size of my router, I don't have to screw this in place. I just put my clamp on there, and then what I do is take the flush trim router bit, and I would flush the top one to match the bottom one. And I made, I think, 22 of these. And then the next step in the process after this, for the shape, the final shape I want, which this is the final shape that I want, is to use the jig on the table saw. Okay. So on the table saw, what I have is just a piece of plywood that set to. I've set the. I actually ended up cutting this piece of plywood with my first cut so that I knew I had the exact measurement here. And I have a little stop right here. I'm going to show you what I do. Put the blank in. Where the sawdust will gather, I use these hold down clamps to hold it. Where the sawdust is gather, I'm using the point, the tip of a corner of a piece of plywood, just an offcut, that will stop this piece in place. What I don't want to have happen is sawdust to gather here and then change the cut over time. And as you can see, this is just a scrap piece of plywood. These hold down clamps are screwed in place. You can adjust the depth on the hold down clamps. You need a fence to put the piece of wood against, and you can see that the piece of wood is overhanging this piece of wood here. The blank is overhanging the sled. Doing a round over, a 1/4 inch round over on all of this. The parts I don't care about are here and here. I actually don't want to round over here because it's going to help me line up the lines when I actually go to install this. So I'm just going to break the edge on this stuff here later. So what I've done is I've put a jig down so that this piece will just slide in between these two pieces of scrap wood. I also want to not round over from this point to this point because the line that I'm lining up to is going to line up here, and I want to be positive as to the location of this later. So I'm using this jig. It's going to lock this in place. The other thing I've done is I've put some scrap wood right here because if I came to the end, my router would dive off, and there's a good chance the piece of wood that I'm routing will go right in here, and this will tip over, and then I'll cut too much right here. So when I route here, this router will be supported by this piece of wood so it doesn't tip on me. If I were only doing one, I may not or may not do a jig, but since I'm doing, I think it's 22. Since I'm doing that many, I just want to be able to do it without thinking too much. And the 5 minutes I spent making this jig, it's just going to make me happier. I won't have to work as hard when I'm doing my work. And so I'm here, just gonna break the edge like that. Okay. So the next part of this is install, and before I put this together, and I pre-measured and put lines on this when they were just pieces of wood sitting on my bench. And the idea is that these lines are the top of the shelf. So you'll probably be able to see this one best. I've got this lined up, so the top of this is on that line. Now I do like quick grips. I think they're fabulous, but nothing beats a clamp that actually has as much holding power as these Bessies. So I like the quick grips when I'm holding a thing and I'm not worried if it slips just a tiny bit or I'm just holding something in place for a second. But if I'm gonna do work on an object that I'm holding in place, I'll use the quick grip to hold it, and then I'll move to a more stable clamp. So here, I'm just using the pre-drill and countersink. This bit is removable so that if it breaks, I can replace it, and it's got a carbide head on it. So I can also set the depth on these drill bits. Really quite like them. These ones are made by Dymar. And they're not a sponsor of me or anything like that. I don't have any sponsors. Not nearly that important. But I've just been using them for over 20 years and I really quite like them. So I'm using 1.25" screws here. What I don't want to have happen is the screw to go through the 1.5" of plywood that's here, but I don't want to use just the 1.25" and not countersink it a bit. So what I do is I use the 1.25", but I countersink it like 1/8 of an inch. I'm still getting 5/8 of an inch of this plywood, and I'm getting 5/8 of an inch on the other side, so it has a lot of holding power. Now on purpose, I didn't glue this in place. If one of these breaks off, I want to have the ability to replace it without having to chisel away all the glue. I'm not putting so much weight on this, any individual one of these, that I'm worried about these screws failing. These screws have a ton of holding power. Not a full ton, but a lot of holding power. The idea is that you know, I'll be using this for however many more years. I'm probably going to ding one of these someday when I'm not doing anything remotely to do with this, and I want to be able to replace it easily. I put an 1/8 inch round over on everything, or no, 1/16 inch round over on everything, just to take the edge off. This unit here has a plate that I built integral to this. So 2 sides, front, and then this piece stops before it gets to this piece. So the idea is that when I screw this to this plywood plate, this piece is really well secured in place and it kept it square. I don't know, it was important to me at the time. And then I'm gonna have these up and down the whole way, and I'm gonna add more right here. And then I'm gonna put sandbags in the bottom of this because this will carry a lot of weight and I wanna keep this from tipping over. If I push it, if the casters catch on something, I definitely want a low center of gravity on this unit. And so this will be my drying rack. I just have a pair of casters, or a set of casters that were just lying around. They're not the greatest casters in the world, but they'll work because I have a fairly smooth floor in my shop. Yeah, and so once I've added the rest of these pieces, this will be my drying rack. Thanks for coming.